The German infantryman lay motionless in the shallow ditch, his breath shallow, eyes fixed on the tree line 200 meters distant. Morning light crept across the frozen field between his position and the forest edge. Somewhere in those pines, someone was watching. His platoon had lost 3 men in 2 days. No artillery, no assault, just sudden cracks and men dropping with holes punched through helmets or throats. The survivors had learned to move only at night, to crawl rather than walk, to freeze when that animal instinct screamed that crosshairs were settling on the back of your neck. This was October 1941, west of Moscow, and the soldier was learning a fundamental truth of the Eastern Front. The land itself had become hostile. Not with mines or wire or machine gun nests, but with invisible marksmen who turned every open space into a killing corridor and every moment of stillness into potential death. This was the Sniper's War. And on the Eastern Front, it would grow into something unprecedented in military history. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 unleashed the largest land war ever fought. 4 million men, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft crashed across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht expected a campaign of maneuver, a war of encirclement and rapid collapse like France had been. What they got instead was something far more grinding. By autumn, as the advance slowed and then froze in the mud and early snows outside Moscow, the nature of combat began to change. The front sprawled across thousands of kilometers, armies dug in, villages became fortresses. Forest blocks turned into contested zones where neither side held clear control. And in these static, attritional conditions, the sniper emerged not as a novelty but as a strategic necessity. The Eastern Front was uniquely suited to sniper warfare. The distances were vast, visibility lines stretched across open steppe, through birch forests, along river valleys and into the endless grey rubble of contested cities. Unlike the dense bocage of France or the urban warrens of Western Europe, the East offered both extreme ranges and intimate ambush zones. A sniper could observe German columns from a kilometre away across wheat fields, or kill at arm's length in the cellars of Stalingrad. The front was too large to be everywhere fortified, too fluid to be everywhere garrisoned. Gaps existed, flanks hung open, and in those gaps lone marksmen or small teams could exert influence far beyond their numbers. But geography alone did not create the sniper war. Doctrine did. The Red Army, even before the war, had a tradition of marksmanship training rooted in the Civil War and the paramilitary rifle clubs of the 1920s and 30s. Soviet military theorists understood that in modern combat the ability to deliver precise fire at extended ranges could shape the battlefield. When war came, the Red Army moved quickly to institutionalize sniping. By late 1941, dedicated sniper schools were being established behind the lines. Soldiers with hunting backgrounds, competitive shooting experience, or simply demonstrated aptitude were pulled from regular units and sent for weeks of intensive training. They learned fieldcraft, camouflage, range estimation, breath control, trigger discipline, observation, and patience. They learned to work in pairs, a shooter and a spotter, the spotter handling the optics and calculations, the shooter taking the shot. They learned that survival meant firing once, maybe twice, and then disappearing. The Soviet sniper program was not merely tactical, it was propaganda. The Red Army understood that in a war of mass mobilization and horrific casualties, heroes mattered. Snipers became those heroes. Their exploits were reported in frontline newspapers, broadcast on radio, celebrated in posters. The message was clear. Even against the mechanized might of the Wehrmacht, individual Soviet soldiers could strike back with deadly precision. This propaganda dimension would shape how the world remembered the Eastern Front's sniper war, sometimes amplifying legends beyond what documentation could support, but always rooted in the real and terrifying effectiveness of trained marksmen. The Germans, by contrast, entered the war with a different tradition. The Wehrmacht had excellent marksmanship standards. German soldiers, many from rural backgrounds with hunting experience, were comfortable with rifles. But the German army did not initially have a centralized sniper doctrine like the Soviets. Instead, it relied on designated marksmen within infantry squads, men given scoped rifles and told to engage targets of opportunity. This worked well enough in the war of movement, but as the front calcified and Soviet snipers began exacting a toll, the Germans adapted. By 1942, the Wehrmacht was pulling soldiers with exceptional shooting skills and sending them to sniper courses. By 1943, sniper training was being formalized, and by 1944, the German military would institute the Scharfschützenabzeichen, the sniper's badge, with 3 classes awarded for 20, 40, and 60 confirmed kills. The timing of this badge's introduction, August 20th, 1944, tells its own story. By then, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive, and snipers had become essential to slowing the Soviet advance. This was the framework. 2 armies grinding against each other across a front that stretched from the Arctic to the Black Sea, both coming to the same conclusion. In static, attritional warfare, the sniper wasn't a luxury, he was a necessity. And the Eastern Front, with its mix of vast distances, ruined cities, dense forests, and millions of men locked in existential combat, would become the proving ground for sniper warfare on an industrial scale. The invasion began in summer heat and dust, but by October the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, had arrived. Roads became rivers of sludge, vehicles bogged down. The German advance, which had covered hundreds of kilometers in weeks, slowed to a crawl. And then came winter. Not the mild European winters the Wehrmacht was accustomed to, but the brutal sub-zero cold of the Russian heartland. Temperatures plunged to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. Weapons froze, men froze, and as both armies dug in, the conditions for sniper warfare took shape. In the forests west of Moscow, Soviet snipers began their work in earnest. These were not yet the celebrated heroes of later years. Many were simply soldiers with hunting backgrounds given scoped Mosin-Nagant rifles and told to make the Germans pay for every metre of frozen ground. The Mosin-Nagant model 1891/30, the standard Soviet rifle, was a robust bolt-action weapon descended from Tsarist-era designs. In its sniper variant, it was fitted with a PE or PEM scope, later replaced by the simpler and more reliable PU scope. The PU, a 3.5 power optic with a fixed reticle, became the defining sight of Soviet snipers. It was not sophisticated by Western standards, but it was durable, cold-resistant, and adequate for engagements out to 400 meters or more in the right hands. The German soldier's nightmare in that first winter was not the T-34 tank breaking through, not the Katyusha rocket screaming overhead, but the lone crack of a rifle from the tree line, and the certainty that someone had just died without ever seeing their killer. Soviet snipers operated from the forests that bordered every road, every village, every supply line. They would infiltrate at night, moving through snow-covered underbrush, and take up positions in trees, in deadfall, behind stumps or snowdrifts. Come dawn, they would begin hunting. A German column moving through the Valdai Hills in December 1941 learned this the hard way. The unit, part of Army Group Center's exhausted spearhead, was strung out along a forest road, trying to reach a supply depot before nightfall. The column halted when the lead truck's driver slumped forward, dead from a bullet through the temple. The soldiers dismounted, taking cover behind vehicles. An officer shouted orders, trying to locate the shooter. A minute passed, 2 minutes. Nothing. The officer raised his head to scan the tree line. Another crack. The officer fell. Panic set in. Men began firing wildly into the forest, hundreds of rounds accomplishing nothing. The sniper, perched 15 meters up in a pine tree, simply waited. When the Germans finally remounted and moved out, he let them go. His mission wasn't to stop the column, but to slow it, to terrify it, to force caution. And it worked. The Soviets understood something fundamental. Snipers did not need to annihilate enemy units. They needed to paralyze them. A sniper killing 2 or 3 men could pin down an entire company for hours. Officers, radio operators, machine gunners, anyone who looked important or moved with authority, these became priority targets. The goal was not just attrition, but psychological destruction. And in the frozen forests of 1941, that psychological campaign began in earnest. Not all early Soviet snipers survived to become legends. Many died in their first weeks, victims of inexperience or bad luck. A sniper who fired from the same position twice was asking to be killed. A sniper who did not account for the smoke signature of his rifle in sub-zero air, where breath and powder smoke hung visible for seconds, was asking to be spotted. A sniper who failed to clear his exfiltration route or who left tracks in fresh snow was asking to be hunted down. The learning curve was steep, and the price of failure was death. But some learned. And as winter deepened, the Red Army began to systematize what worked. Snipers were paired with spotters. The spotter carried binoculars or a trench periscope, scanning for targets while the shooter focused on the scope picture. The spotter calculated wind and distance, kept track of ammunition, and most critically, watched for enemy counter-snipers. This partnership reduced the tunnel vision that killed so many lone shooters. It also allowed for sustained observation. A sniper might spend hours, even days, watching a single sector waiting for a target valuable enough to justify breaking concealment. The Germans, meanwhile, were adapting under fire. They began moving only at night in contested zones. They started using smoke to obscure movement across open ground. They trained soldiers to low-crawl under fire rather than run. They learned not to cluster around officers or radios, and they began hunting Soviet snipers systematically. German counter-sniper tactics in 1941 were rudimentary but effective. The most common method was overwhelming firepower. When a Soviet sniper revealed his position, German units would call in mortar or artillery fire, saturating the suspected hide with high explosive. If artillery was unavailable, machine guns would rake the area, hoping to force the sniper to move or suppress him long enough for an assault team to close in. Another method was the decoy, a helmet on a stick, raised above a trench parapet. If the sniper took the bait and fired, his muzzle flash might give away his position. It was crude, but in open ground or forest edges where hides were limited, it worked often enough. One German Gefreiter, a hunter from Bavaria before the war, was given a scoped Karabiner 98 Kurz and told to countersnipe. The Kar-98K, the standard German rifle, was a Mauser action bolt gun renowned for accuracy. With a Zeiss or Hensoldt scope, it became a precision instrument. This Gefreiter, whose name is lost to history, spent 3 weeks in December 1941 positioned in a ruined barn outside a village west of Kalinin. His job was simple: watch the Soviet line, identify sniper hides, and kill the shooters before they killed his comrades. He worked alone, without a spotter, relying on his hunter's instincts. He learned to watch for unnatural shadows in tree lines, for the faint glint of an optic catching low-angle sunlight, for disturbances in snow that indicated a man had been there. In 3 weeks he claimed 7 kills, all Soviet snipers. Then a Soviet artillery barrage collapsed the barn on him, and he was evacuated with a shattered leg. His war was over, but his method lived on. By the end of 1941, the sniper war was established as a permanent feature of the Eastern Front. The German advance had stalled. The Red Army, though battered, had not collapsed, and in the frozen stalemate that followed, both sides realized that controlling the space between the lines, the no-man's land of contested villages and forests and fields, required not just artillery and infantry, but marksmen who could dominate sightlines and deny the enemy freedom of movement. The sniper was no longer an experiment, he was doctrine. To understand the German sniper war, one must first understand how a soldier became a sniper. It was not a simple process, and it was not open to everyone. The Wehrmacht, despite its propaganda image of uniformity and discipline, was an organization built on regional identities and social hierarchies. Hunters and foresters held a certain status. Men from the Alpine regions, from East Prussia, from the rural districts of Bavaria and Saxony, these men were assumed to possess innate fieldcraft, and in many cases, they did. Take the example of Gefreiter Klaus Bergmann. Bergmann was born in 1920 in a small village in the Bavarian Alps. His father was a forester, and Klaus grew up hunting chamois, red deer, and wild boar in the mountains. By the time he was conscripted in 1939, he had been shooting for 15 years. He understood wind, elevation, animal behavior, patience. When he arrived at his infantry regiment, part of the 7th Infantry Division, his company commander noticed his marksmanship scores during training. Bergmann was hitting targets at 300 meters with iron sights consistently, while other recruits struggled at half that distance. In the early campaigns, Poland and France, Bergmann served as a standard rifleman, but his platoon sergeant, who had been a hunter himself, recognized talent when he saw it. After France, the sergeant requested that Bergman be given a scoped rifle. The request was approved. Bergman received a Kar 98K fitted with a Zeiss Zielvier scope, a 4-power optic that was considered the gold standard of German military optics. The rifle was not officially designated for sniper use. It was simply a better tool for a skilled marksman. Bergman was told to engage targets of opportunity and to provide long-range support for his squad. When the division deployed to the east in June 1941, Bergman was one of perhaps 24 men in the regiment with scoped rifles. There was no formal doctrine, no training course, no designation as sniper. He was simply a good shot with better equipment. But as the campaign dragged into autumn and winter, that began to change. The first time Bergman was asked to specifically target an enemy officer, it was during a firefight outside Vyazma in October. Soviet forces were dug in along a ridgeline, and German infantry was pinned down in the valley below. Bergman's company commander pulled him aside and pointed to a figure in a Soviet greatcoat, visible through binoculars at roughly 400 meters, directing troops and gesturing toward the German positions. Bergman set up behind a fallen log, adjusted his scope for the range and the crosswind coming from the northwest, and waited for a clear shot. The Soviet officer moved erratically, ducking behind cover, then reappearing. Bergman controlled his breathing, let his heart rate settle, and when the officer paused to look through his own binoculars, Bergman fired. The officer dropped. The Soviet defense wavered. German infantry pushed forward and took the position. That kill changed something in Bergman. It was the first time he had fired at a human being with deliberation and forethought, not in the chaos of a firefight, but as a calculated act. He thought about it that night, lying in his foxhole, staring at the stars. The man had been just a shape in the scope, a target. But Bergman knew he had killed a thinking person, someone with a name, a family, a life that had ended because Bergman had squeezed a trigger. He did not feel guilt, exactly. Guilt required a moral framework the combat had already eroded. What he felt was awareness. He had crossed into something different. He was no longer infantry. He was something colder. By December, Bergman's reputation had spread through the regiment. Other companies began requesting him for specific missions. He was sent to observe Soviet positions and report on activity. He was assigned to cover river crossings, to protect flanks during withdrawals, to eliminate machine gunners who were holding up advances. He killed 19 Soviet soldiers that winter, each one carefully logged by his platoon sergeant, who saw value in documenting what this new type of warfare could accomplish. But Bergman was still not officially a sniper. The designation did not exist yet in Wehrmacht doctrine. He was a Scharfschütze, a sharpshooter, a term that carried no formal weight. It was not until 1942, after the experiences of the first winter, that the German military began to understand that sniping required specialization. By mid-1942, as the German summer offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad was underway, the Wehrmacht began establishing dedicated sniper training courses. These were not centralized schools like the Soviet system. Instead, they were division-level or corps-level programs, typically lasting 2 to 3 weeks, focused on taking soldiers who already demonstrated marksmanship ability and refining them into true snipers. The 3rd Mountain Division, fighting in the Caucasus, created one of the first formal programs. The division, composed largely of Austrians and Bavarians from Alpine regions, had a higher-than-average number of men with hunting backgrounds. The division's chief of staff, recognizing the value of snipers in the mountain warfare they were conducting, authorized the creation of a training detachment. 20 soldiers from across the division's regiments were pulled from the line and sent to a rear area camp near Pyatigorsk. The course was run by Hauptmann Franz Koller, a career officer who had been a competitive shooter before the war. Koller understood that marksmanship was only one component of sniping. The men who arrived at his course could already shoot. What they needed to learn was how to survive. The curriculum began with camouflage. Koller would take his students into the forested foothills and have them construct hides. Then he would walk the area, searching for them. Any student whose hide Koller could spot from 50 meters failed the exercise and had to start over. The point was drilled home. Invisibility mattered more than shooting ability. A sniper who could not hide was a dead sniper. Next came observation, and Koller taught his students to use binoculars and spotting scopes. to scan terrain systematically to recognize micro-terrain features that indicated enemy positions. He taught them to estimate range using known dimensions, to read wind from vegetation movement, to account for mirage in heat and for temperature gradients at dawn and dusk. He taught them that patience was a weapon. A sniper might observe an enemy position for 6 hours before taking a single shot. That discipline, that willingness to wait, separated snipers from ordinary soldiers. The students learned fieldcraft, how to move without sound, how to low crawl for hundreds of meters, how to use shadows and dead ground, how to approach a hide without leaving tracks or disturbed vegetation. They learned about wind calls, about mirage, about the physics of a bullet's flight. They learned that a rifle zeroed at 200 meters would shoot high at 100 and low at 300. They learned about parallax in their scopes, about eye relief, about how to maintain zero in extreme cold or heat. They also learned about psychology. Koller brought in soldiers who had been targeted by Soviet snipers, and those men described what it felt like. The constant fear, the reluctance to move, the way entire platoons would freeze when a sniper was active. Koller told his students that their job wasn't just to kill, but to create that fear. One sniper in the right position could paralyze a battalion. That was the goal. At the end of the course, 12 of the original 20 students graduated. 8 had failed, unable to master the fieldcraft or lacking the mental discipline. The 12 who passed returned to their regiments with new rifles, better optics, and a designation. They were now snipers tasked with seeking out and killing enemy officers, machine gunners, artillery observers, and any other high-value targets. One of those graduates was Obergefreiter Martin Hirsch, a farmer's son from Styria in Austria. Hirsch had grown up hunting in the Austrian Alps, stalking ibex and red deer in terrain that required days of patient tracking. He brought that mindset to the course, and Koller recognized it immediately. Hirsch understood that hunting was not about speed or aggression, it was about becoming part of the landscape, about moving so slowly and so carefully that the prey never knew you were there. Hirsch's first sniper kill after graduating the course came in the mountains south of Tuapse, where the 3rd Mountain Division was fighting to break through toward the Black Sea coast. Soviet forces held the ridgelines and German attacks were being chewed apart by machine gun fire. Hirsch was assigned to suppress a Soviet heavy machine gun position that was dominating a valley. The position was well protected, dug into rocks with overhead cover, and previous attempts to destroy it with mortars had failed. Hirsch spent 2 days observing the position from a hide 800 meters away. He noted that the gun crew rotated every 4 hours, and that during the rotation the relief crew would approach from a trail on the reverse slope. The trail was visible for only a brief section, perhaps 10 meters, before it disappeared into dead ground. Hirsch calculated that if he positioned himself correctly, he could engage the relief crew during that exposed section. On the 3rd day, Hirsch repositioned to a new hide, closer to the trail, at roughly 300 meters. He camouflaged himself among rocks and scrub vegetation, and waited. At the appointed hour, the relief crew appeared, 4 men, carrying ammunition crates and a replacement barrel. Hirsch let them enter the exposed section, then fired. The lead man dropped. The others dove for cover. Hirsch worked his bolt, acquired the second man, and fired again. Hit, the remaining 2 men abandoned the ammunition and fled back down the trail. The machine gun position, now unsupplied and unable to rotate crews without risking ambush, fell silent. German infantry assaulted and took the position that afternoon. Hirsch had not destroyed the gun, but he had made it operationally useless. That was sniper warfare, not always about the kill count, but about creating effects that enabled other units to succeed. What separated a sniper from an ordinary soldier was not physical ability, but mental architecture. Snipers had to be comfortable with isolation. They worked alone or in pairs, often far from friendly lines, without support. If something went wrong, no one was coming to save them. This reality filtered out soldiers who needed the comfort of the group, who drew strength from being part of a unit. Snipers also had to possess a particular relationship with violence. Infantry combat was chaotic, reactive. You saw movement, you fired, you moved, you survived. Killing was abstract, one figure among many in the smoke and noise. Sniper killing was different. It was intimate, even at distance. You watched your target for minutes or hours. You saw him eat, smoke, talk to his comrades. You learned his habits. And then you killed him, watching through the scope as the bullet struck, as he fell, as his comrades reacted. There was no abstraction. It was direct, personal, deliberate. Some men could not handle that intimacy. They broke during training or after their first kill, unable to reconcile the deliberate nature of sniper warfare with whatever moral framework they carried. Others found it liberating. The rules of normal combat, the brotherhood, the shared risk, none of that applied to snipers. They were outside the structure. They made their own decisions, chose their own targets, operated on their own timeline. For men who chafed under military discipline, who valued autonomy, sniping offered a kind of freedom, but that freedom came with a price. Snipers were hated. By the enemy, obviously. Captured snipers on both sides were often executed on the spot. But snipers were also viewed with suspicion by their own comrades. They did not participate in assaults. They did not hold the line. They killed from hiding and then disappeared. To ordinary infantry, snipers seemed cowardly, even if intellectually they understood the value. This social isolation reinforced the psychological isolation. Snipers became loners by necessity. Consider the experience of Unteroffizier Paul Richter, a sniper with the 97th Jaeger Division. Richter had been a forester in Pomerania before the war, and he brought a forester's patience to sniping. He operated primarily in the forests and swamps of the Central Front, where visibility was limited and engagements happened at close range. Richter once spent 5 days in a hide, overlooking a Soviet supply route, living on the black bread and sausage he had carried in, urinating into a canteen to avoid leaving the hide, watching columns of trucks and infantry pass below him. On the 5th day, a Soviet staff car stopped near his position. 3 officers got out to confer over a map. Richter killed all 3 in 6 seconds. Then he crawled out of the hide, moving at a pace of perhaps 20 meters per hour to avoid detection, and exfiltrated back to German lines. He arrived 2 days later, exhausted, dehydrated, and alive. When Richter returned to his unit, he was greeted with a mixture of respect and unease. His company commander congratulated him on the kills, but the other soldiers avoided him. They had been fighting continuously for those 5 days, losing men in attacks and counterattacks, while Richter had been alone in the woods. They knew his work was valuable, but they also resented it. Richter stopped eating with the others. He stayed apart, cleaning his rifle, studying maps, planning his next mission. The isolation suited him. He had discovered something about himself. He preferred the company of trees and silence to the company of men. This psychological profile was common among successful snipers. They were often introverted, comfortable with solitude, capable of enduring boredom, and able to shift instantly from passive observation to lethal action. They did not need external validation. The kill count was not about glory. It was about competence, about the satisfaction of a difficult task executed perfectly. Some snipers kept detailed logs, recording every shot, every range, every environmental condition. They treated sniping as a craft to be perfected, an art form with rules and aesthetics. But there was a darkness to it as well, spending days or weeks in a state of heightened awareness, watching for threats, waiting for targets. It did things to the mind. Snipers developed hypervigilance that did not turn off. They scanned civilians in rear areas looking for threats. They flinched at sudden sounds. They dreamed about being hunted, about crosshairs on their own backs. The psychological toll accumulated invisibly, manifesting in insomnia, irritability, emotional numbness. There was no term for it then, no framework for understanding combat stress. Snipers simply endured, or they broke. The second year of the war saw the sniper program mature on both sides. The Red Army, having survived the initial onslaught, began to industrialize its training. Multiple sniper schools were established behind the lines, some attached to armies or fronts, others centralized in cities like Moscow. One of the most significant developments was the creation of the Central Women's Sniper Training School in the spring of 1942. This was not a propaganda stunt. The Soviet Union, facing catastrophic manpower losses, was mobilizing every resource. Women with shooting backgrounds were recruited, trained, and deployed to frontline units. They would prove just as lethal as their male counterparts. Among the first graduates of the women's sniper program was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a young woman from Kiev who had been a competitive shooter before the war. She began her combat service in the defense of Odessa in 1941, then fought in the siege of Sevastopol in 1942. Pavlichenko was methodical and patient, traits that kept her alive and made her deadly. Her commonly cited kill total is 309 confirmed, a figure that includes both German soldiers and counter-snipers. What made her notable was not just the number, but the consistency. She worked in ruins, forests, and open trenches, adapting to each environment. In Sevastopol, during the brutal siege that lasted from October 1941 to July 1942, she operated in conditions that broke lesser soldiers. The city was under constant bombardment, water was rationed, food was scarce. And yet, the defenders held, and snipers like Pavlichenko made the German advance so costly that every meter forward was paid for in blood. Sevastopol was a crucible for sniper warfare. The city, on the southwestern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, was surrounded by German and Romanian forces. The defenders, a mix of Red Army regulars, Black Sea Fleet sailors, and NKVD troops, held a shrinking perimeter that stretched along coastal cliffs, through suburban neighborhoods, and into fortified positions in the hills. Snipers on both sides used the broken terrain to deadly effect. Soviet snipers positioned themselves in collapsed buildings, in rocky outcrops overlooking German assembly areas, and in the maze of bunkers and trenches that ringed the city. German snipers, many from mountain divisions experienced in alpine warfare, did the same. The siege produced a particular kind of sniper combat, close range, urban, and relentless. Engagements happened at 100 meters, sometimes less. A Soviet sniper might spend an entire day in a shattered apartment building, watching a German-held crossroads through a crack in the rubble, waiting for a target to expose himself for the seconds it took to dash across the street. The shot, when it came, had to be instant and precise. There was no second chance. If the sniper missed, or if his muzzle flash was spotted, German machine guns or mortars would reduce his hide to dust. Pavlichenko survived Sevastopol by never repeating herself. She changed positions constantly, never firing more than once or twice from the same spot. She used the rubble's acoustics to her advantage. In dense ruins, sound bounced unpredictably. A shot fired from one building might seem to come from another. She also relied on her spotter, a young sailor named Kovalenko, who handled the initial observation and gave her firing solutions. When Sevastopol finally fell in July 1942, Pavlichenko was evacuated by submarine, one of the last defenders to escape. She would later tour the United States as part of a Soviet propaganda effort, becoming the face of the Red Army sniper program to Western audiences. But her legend was built in the ruins of Sevastopol, where she learned that survival in sniper warfare required not heroism but cold, patient professionalism. While Sevastopol burned, another siege was tightening around Leningrad in the north. The city had been encircled since September 1941, cut off except for a fragile supply line across Lake Ladoga. The siege would last 900 days, and snipers would play a constant role in the grinding attrition. The Leningrad front was different from Sevastopol. It was not a compact urban fortress, but a sprawling perimeter that included suburban neighborhoods, industrial zones, forests, and swampland. The German lines in some places were only a few hundred meters from Soviet positions. In others, kilometers of no man's land separated the armies. This variety of terrain demanded different sniper techniques. In the suburban sectors, Soviet snipers operated from houses and apartment blocks that overlooked German trenches. They would occupy attics or upper floors, cutting firing ports that were invisible from outside, and spend days watching enemy activity. A German soldier lighting a cigarette in his trench, an officer inspecting wire obstacles, a machine gun crew setting up in a new position, all were potential targets. The goal was not always to kill, but to observe and report. Soviet artillery relied on sniper teams to provide accurate intelligence about German dispositions. If a sniper reported heavy vehicle movement or the construction of new bunkers, it indicated an impending attack. The sniper's role expanded beyond shooting to become part of the reconnaissance network. In the forested sectors north of Leningrad, sniper warfare took on a different character. The forests were dense with birch, pine, and underbrush. Visibility was limited to a few dozen meters in most places, but occasional clearings and logging roads created kill zones. Soviet snipers would infiltrate deep into no man's land, sometimes spending days behind enemy lines, living off what they carried and whatever they could scavenge. They would hide in trees, in deadfall, or in shallow scrapes covered with branches and moss. Their mission was to interdict German supply lines and rear area movement. A convoy moving up a forest road would suddenly come under fire, lose a vehicle or two, and halt. The sniper would be gone before the Germans could react, melting back into the forest. These deep infiltration missions were extraordinarily dangerous. If captured, snipers could expect no mercy, but they were effective at creating a sense of insecurity in German rear areas, forcing the diversion of troops to guard supply lines. As 1942 progressed, the focus of the war shifted south. The German summer offensive, Vollblau, aimed to seize the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The advance began in late June, and by August, German spearheads were approaching Stalingrad from the west. The city, a sprawling industrial centre stretching for 30 kilometres along the river's west bank, would become the defining battle of the war, and it would become the defining battle of the Sniper War. Stalingrad in the late summer of 1942 was a functioning city, home to hundreds of thousands of civilians and a vital manufacturing hub. German bombers reduced it to rubble in a matter of weeks. By September, when German ground forces entered the city, Stalingrad was a wasteland of shattered factories, collapsed apartment blocks, and burning oil refineries. The Soviets defended it street by street, building by building, room by room, and in this apocalyptic landscape, snipers thrived. The ruins of Stalingrad offered perfect conditions for sniper warfare. Long sight lines down rubble-choked streets gave clear fields of fire. Collapsed buildings provided countless hides. The maze-like terrain made flanking and assault difficult, and the density of combat meant targets were abundant. German soldiers accustomed to maneuver warfare found themselves trapped in a meat grinder where every corner, every window, every pile of bricks might conceal a Soviet marksman. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers stopped moving during daylight. They navigated the city by crawling through basements and sewers. They learned that standing upright, even for a moment, was suicide. Soviet defenders understood that they could not trade firepower with the Germans. The Wehrmacht had more artillery, more aircraft, more tanks. But in the ruins, those advantages mattered less. What mattered was small unit combat, close quarters fighting, and the ability to make the Germans pay for every meter. Snipers became the core of this defensive strategy. Red Army Command encouraged sniper teams to operate independently, choosing their own positions and targets. This decentralization allowed snipers to exploit the chaos and confusion of urban combat. One of the snipers who would emerge from Stalingrad was Vasily Zaitsev, a soldier from the Ural Mountains who had been a clique in the Soviet Navy before the war. Zaitsev was not a professional hunter or a competitive shooter. He learned to shoot as a child, hunting deer and wolves in the forest near his village. When he arrived at Stalingrad in September 1942 as part of the 62nd Army, he was just another rifleman. But his commanders noticed his marksmanship skills and gave him a scoped Mosin Nagant. Zaitsev would go on to claim a significant number of kills during the battle, though the exact figure is disputed. Soviet propaganda at the time reported numbers in excess of 200, but later scholarship suggests the documented total is lower. What is not disputed is that Zaitsev became a symbol, both during and after the battle, of Soviet resistance in the ruins. Zaitsev's method was straightforward. He worked with a spotter, often another sniper named Nikolai Kulikov, and they would occupy positions in the factory district on Stalingrad's northern edge. The Red October factory, the Barakadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory were all sites of intense fighting, and all offered excellent sniper hides. Zaitsev preferred firing from inside buildings rather than from elevated positions. He would set up behind a crack in a wall or a small gap in the rubble, with his rifle resting on a stable surface, and wait. Patience was his primary tool. He understood that Soviet snipers had one advantage. They knew the ground. The Germans were attacking, moving through unfamiliar terrain, and that movement created vulnerability. One of Zaitsev's documented engagements involved targeting a German machine gun position that was suppressing a Soviet infantry advance. The machine gun was set up in a second-floor window of a half-collapsed building, well protected by sandbags and debris. Zaitsev observed the position for 2 days, noting the crew's habits. They rotated shifts at predictable intervals. The relief crew approached from an interior stairwell, meaning Zaitsev could not shoot them on their way in. But when the gun fired, the muzzle flash and smoke gave away the exact position. Zaitsev waited for the gun to open fire, confirming the crew was in place, and then put a round through the narrow gap in the sandbags, hitting the gunner in the head. The gun went silent. The German crew evacuated the position, and the Soviet infantry pushed forward. This was the reality of Zaitsev's work: methodical, calculated, and deadly. The dramatic sniper duel between Zaitsev and a supposed German super sniper named Erwin König, popularized by Soviet propaganda and later by films and books, is almost certainly a myth. No German records confirm the existence of König or such a duel. The story served a narrative purpose, turning Zaitsev into a folk hero, but it was not necessary. His actual combat record, stripped of embellishment, was formidable enough. The broader truth of Stalingrad was that hundreds of Soviet snipers operated in the ruins, and they collectively broke the German advance. The Wehrmacht entered the city, expecting to clear it in weeks. Instead, they were trapped in a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions. Snipers were part of that grinder. They killed officers, disrupted communications, pinned down infantry, and forced the Germans to move only at night or under the cover of smoke and artillery. The German Sixth Army, which had started the battle with confidence, found itself paralysed by fear of what lurked in the rubble. German forces in Stalingrad did have their own snipers, and they were effective. German marksmen, many veterans of earlier campaigns, used the same ruins to target Soviet positions. One German sniper, operating in the Central District, reportedly killed 32 Soviet soldiers in a single week by targeting a supply route that Soviet troops used to move ammunition forward. His hide was a collapsed chimney stack that overlooked a narrow alley. He would fire at dawn or dusk when light angles made it difficult to spot muzzle flash, and then withdraw through a pre-planned route that led through cellars and sewers. Soviet forces eventually located the hide and destroyed it with satchel charges, but the sniper had already moved on. The battle for Stalingrad raged through the autumn and into winter. By November, the Germans were exhausted, and the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive that encircled the Sixth Army. The pocket was sealed. The sniper war did not end, it intensified. German snipers, now fighting for survival, targeted Soviet supply lines and strongpoints in a desperate attempt to slow the tightening noose. Soviet snipers continued hunting, but their mission shifted. They were told to target German commanders, to disrupt any attempt at breakout, and to maintain pressure on the collapsing pocket. By February 1943, when the last German forces surrendered, the city was a frozen graveyard, and the sniper war at Stalingrad had become legend. To truly understand the German sniper experience, one must look beyond individual stories to the institutional structures. Different divisions developed different sniper cultures based on their composition, their commanders, and their combat experiences. The 1st Mountain Division, for example, drew heavily from Bavaria and Austria, regions with strong hunting traditions. The division's soldiers were accustomed to mountain warfare, to steep terrain, to limited visibility, to the need for individual initiative. When the division fought in the Caucasus and later in the Balkans, its snipers excelled. They used high ground naturally, understanding how elevation affected ballistics, how valleys funneled wind, how ridgelines offered concealment and observation simultaneously. The division's sniper program emphasized stalking skills, the ability to move through broken terrain without sound or visibility, and the patience to wait for perfect shots. Many of the division's snipers had learned to hunt ibex in the Alps, animals so wary and so difficult to approach that success required days of effort for a single kill. That mentality translated directly to sniper warfare. The 3rd Mountain Division, which produced Matthias Hetzenauer, had a similar culture. Hetzenauer himself embodied it, an Austrian Tyrolean who had hunted chamois since childhood, who understood that mountain hunting was about endurance and patience, not speed. When Hetzenauer was pulled from his unit in 1943 and sent to a divisional sniper course, he already possessed 90% of the skills he needed. The course simply formalized what he knew instinctively. But not all divisions had that advantage. Urban divisions drawn from cities like Berlin, Hamburg, or Munich had fewer men with hunting backgrounds. For these divisions, creating effective snipers required more intensive training. The 71st Infantry Division, which fought at Stalingrad and later in defensive battles across Ukraine, had to build its sniper program almost from scratch. The division pulled men who showed marksmanship aptitude during basic training and sent them to corps-level courses where they learned fieldcraft from the ground up. These urban snipers often struggled initially with concealment and movement, skills that came naturally to hunters but had to be taught to city dwellers. But they adapted. By 1943, the 71st Sniper Platoon was as effective as any in the army, proof that training could overcome lack of background, given time and good instruction. The Waffen-SS divisions developed their own sniper programs, often parallel to but separate from the Wehrmacht. SS divisions like the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich and Totenkopf had access to better equipment and training resources than many army divisions. SS snipers were often equipped with the finest optics available, including high magnification scopes that allowed engagements at extreme ranges. But equipment alone did not make them superior. What distinguished SS snipers was often their ideological commitment. They fought with a fanaticism that regular army soldiers lacked, a willingness to take risks and accept casualties that reflected the SS's overall combat culture. This made them dangerous but also predictable. SS snipers were more likely to hold positions to the death, more likely to engage in risky shots, more likely to die. Army snipers, by contrast, tended to be more pragmatic, more focused on survival, more willing to disengage when a position became untenable. One SS sniper, Rottenführer Heinrich Blücher of the Das Reich division, demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. Blücher, a farmer's son from Westphalia, joined the SS in 1939 and fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, and then the Eastern Front. He was a competent shot, but not exceptional. What made him effective was aggression. Blücher would take positions close to Soviet lines, sometimes within 100 meters, and engage targets rapidly, firing multiple shots before displacing. This violated every principle of sniper fieldcraft, but in the chaos of fluid combat, it sometimes worked. Blücher survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, claiming over 40 kills, before he was killed in July 1943 during the Battle of Kursk. He had set up in a burnt-out tank to engage Soviet infantry, and when Soviet forces overran the position, Blücher refused to withdraw. He was found dead inside the tank, his rifle empty, surrounded by spent casings. The ideological dimension of SS combat culture had gotten him killed, but it had also made him willing to fight in situations where other snipers would have retreated. Every effective sniper team was built on the partnership between shooter and spotter. The shooter got the glory, the kill count, the recognition, but the spotter was often the more important half of the team. He carried the optics, the range-finding equipment, the maps and notes. He scanned for targets, calculated distances, read wind, and most critically, he watched for threats while the shooter was focused through the scope. Consider the partnership between Obergefreiter Johann Meyer, a shooter, and Gefreiter Thomas Wald, his spotter, both from the 97th Jäger Division. Meyer was a good shot, calm under pressure, disciplined. Wald was a former surveyor who understood angles, distances, and mathematics. Together they were deadly. Wald's role began before the team even entered a hide. He would study maps of their operational area, identifying likely enemy positions, calculating fields of fire, noting dead ground, and approach routes. When they moved into position, Wald navigated, using terrain features to avoid detection. Once in the hide, Wald set up his spotting scope, a high magnification optic that allowed him to observe at greater ranges than Meyer's rifle scope. Wald scanned systematically, dividing the landscape into sectors and searching each sector methodically for signs of enemy activity. When Wald identified a potential target, he would range it using known dimensions. If he saw a Soviet truck, he knew it was roughly 5 meters long. By measuring how much of his reticle the truck occupied, he could calculate distance. He would note wind indicators, smoke, grass movement, mirage. He would relay all of this to Meyer, who would adjust his scope and prepare the shot. Wald would then watch through his scope, observing the target and the surrounding area. If the target moved, Wald would update the range. If other threats appeared, Wald would alert Meyer to break off the engagement. After Meyer fired, Wald's job became even more critical. He would watch the bullet's impact through his scope, noting whether it hit or missed and by how much. If it missed, Wald would give Meyer a correction. Left 1 meter, low. Meyer would adjust and fire again. But more importantly, Wald would watch for enemy reaction. If Soviet soldiers started scanning for the sniper's position, if artillery observers began calling in fire, Wald would tell Meyer to displace immediately. The relationship between shooter and spotter required absolute trust. Meyer had to believe that Wald's ranges were accurate, that his wind calls were correct, that his threat assessments were sound. Wald had to trust that Meyer would take the shots he was given, that he would follow direction without argument, that he would prioritize the mission over ego. In the best teams, this trust became instinctive. The two men could communicate with gestures, with minimal words, with a shared understanding built over months of working together. Meyer and Wald operated together for 18 months, from mid-1942 to late 1943, mostly in the forests and swamps of the Central Front. They claimed 73 confirmed kills in that time, a respectable but not extraordinary number. What made them effective was consistency and survival. They never took unnecessary risks. They never stayed in a hide longer than necessary. They always had an exfiltration plan, and they trusted each other completely. In October 1943, during a Soviet offensive near Nevel, Meyer and Wald were operating in a forest sector tasked with slowing a Soviet advance. They set up in a hide overlooking a trail that Soviet reinforcements were using. Over 2 days, they engaged multiple targets, killing 8 Soviet soldiers. On the third day, Soviet infantry located their general area and began a sweep. Wald, scanning behind their position, saw the Soviet troops approaching. He tapped Meyer's shoulder twice, the signal to withdraw immediately. The two men low-crawled out of the hide, moving perpendicular to the Soviet advance, and extracted without being spotted. A less disciplined team might have stayed to take a few more shots. Meyer and Wald understood that survival meant knowing when to leave. The spotter's contribution was rarely recognized. Meyer received an Iron Cross Second Class for his sniper work. Wald received nothing. But Meyer knew the truth. Without Wald, he would have been dead within weeks. The kills were shared, even if the credit was not. As the war progressed, both sides refined their equipment and techniques. The Germans in particular experimented with various rifle and optic combinations, seeking advantages in range, accuracy and reliability. The standard Kar-98K with Zeiss or Hensoldt scope remained the primary German sniper rifle throughout the war, but variations emerged. Some snipers preferred the long-barreled Kar-98K for its superior accuracy at extended ranges. Others used captured Soviet Mosin Nagants, appreciating their ruggedness and the fact that the rifle's report sounded Soviet, providing a moment of confusion that could aid exfiltration. German optics were generally superior to Soviet equivalents. The Zeiss Zielvier scope, with its 4-power magnification and precision reticle, was considered excellent. Later in the war, some snipers received 6-power scopes, allowing engagements beyond 500 meters under ideal conditions. The challenge with high magnification scopes was field of view. A 6-power scope had a narrow field of view, making target acquisition difficult in close terrain. Snipers had to balance magnification against situational awareness. The introduction of the Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifle in 1943 offered new possibilities. The G43 could be fitted with a ZF4 scope and used for rapid engagements. One German sniper, Feldwebel Ernst Kramer of the 106th Infantry Division, became a proponent of the G43 after testing it in late 1943. Kramer appreciated the ability to take multiple shots without working a bolt. In urban combat, or when engaging multiple targets, the semi-automatic action gave him a decisive edge. The downside was weight and complexity. The G43 was heavier than the Kar-98K, and more prone to jamming in mud or extreme cold. Kramer carried both rifles on missions, using the G43 when he expected close-range rapid engagements, and the Kar-98K for long-range precision work. Ammunition also evolved. German snipers initially used standard ball ammunition, the same rounds used by infantry, but by 1943 some units were issuing match-grade ammunition to snipers, rounds manufactured to tighter tolerances for improved accuracy. The difference was measurable. At 300 meters, match ammunition could reduce group size by 30% compared to standard ball. At 500 meters, the advantage was even greater. Not all snipers received match ammunition, supply was limited, but those who did guarded it jealously, using it only for critical shots. Soviet snipers, meanwhile, stuck primarily with the Mosin Nagant and PU scope combination. The system worked, and the Soviets saw no reason to change it. Some snipers used the SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle with a PU scope, but the SVT-40 was less reliable than the Mosin Nagant and more difficult to maintain. Most Soviet snipers preferred the bolt action for its simplicity and durability. One area where Soviet snipers innovated was camouflage. Soviet sniper schools taught elaborate camouflage construction, including the creation of ghillie suits from burlap, netting, and natural materials. Soviet snipers would spend hours preparing their suits, weaving grass, leaves, and twigs into the fabric to match the local environment. In forests, they used moss and bark. In urban ruins, they used torn fabric and dust-colored cloth. The goal was to break up the human outline so completely that even at close range, an observer would see only terrain. German snipers also used camouflage, though often less systematically. Some wore reversible winter/summer smocks with mottled patterns. Others constructed their own ghillie suits, learning the technique from captured Soviet equipment or from trial and error. The best German snipers understood that camouflage was not just about colour, but about shape, shadow, and movement. A perfectly coloured suit was useless if it created an unnatural silhouette, or if the wearer moved carelessly. Sniping forced men to confront questions that other soldiers could avoid. What did it mean to kill a man who had no chance to defend himself? What was the difference between this and murder? These were not abstract ethical debates. They were real questions that snipers faced every time they looked through the scope at a human being and decided whether to squeeze the trigger. Some snipers resolved this by dehumanization. The target was not a person but an object, a problem to be solved. Gefreiter Ludwig Stein, a sniper with the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, described his method in a letter to his brother. "I do not see men, I see shapes. The shape moves, I calculate the shot, I fire. If the shape falls, I have succeeded. If it does not, I have failed. There is nothing else." This clinical detachment allowed Stein to function without moral anguish, but it came at a cost. Stein became emotionally numb, unable to connect with others, unable to feel anything beyond the narrow focus of his craft. Other snipers embraced a warrior ethos, viewing themselves as hunters of dangerous game. They respected their targets as worthy opponents, even as they killed them. Obergefreiter Friedrich Lang, a hunter from the Black Forest who became a sniper with the 94th Infantry Division, wrote in his diary, "The Soviet soldier is not my enemy in the sense of hatred. He is my opponent in a contest. He tries to kill me, I try to kill him. There is honor in this, a clarity that other forms of war lack. When I kill, I do so cleanly, with respect for the man's courage in being here at all." Lang's perspective allowed him to maintain his humanity while performing inhuman acts, but it was a fragile construction. When Lang was wounded in 1944 and evacuated, he struggled to reconcile his warrior philosophy with the industrial slaughter he had witnessed. Still, other snipers simply stopped thinking about it. They did their job because it was their job, because someone had to do it, because the alternative was to refuse and face consequences. Unteroffizier Karl Brenner, a former clerk from Leipzig who became a sniper with the 296th Infantry Division, operated on autopilot. He took the shots he was ordered to take. He logged the kills in his notebook. He cleaned his rifle, slept when he could, and tried not to think beyond the next mission. Brenner survived the war, returned to Leipzig, and never spoke about his time as a sniper. When asked by family members what he had done during the war, he would say only, "I was in the infantry." The truth was buried so deep that even he could not access it without unraveling. The psychological toll of sniping manifested in different ways. Some snipers became addicted to the work, craving the adrenaline spike of the hunt and the kill. They volunteered for increasingly dangerous missions, took riskier shots, pushed themselves until they made mistakes, and died. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming silent and distant, present physically but absent emotionally. Still others broke completely, refusing to shoot, abandoning their posts, or turning their weapons on themselves. The Wehrmacht had no systematic way of dealing with combat stress. Soldiers who broke down were often labelled cowards and punished. Snipers who refused to continue were reassigned to infantry units, effectively a death sentence since they lacked the training and instinct for close combat. The only acceptable response to psychological strain was to endure, and most snipers did, at least until they were killed, wounded, or the war ended. The German defeat at Stalingrad marked a turning point. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing, it was defending. And in defensive warfare, snipers became even more valuable. The summer of 1943 brought Operation Citadel, the German attempt to pinch off the Kursk salient. The battle, the largest tank engagement in history, ended in German failure and Soviet counteroffensive. As the Red Army pushed west, the front lines stabilized into elaborate defensive belts. These belts, with their trenches, bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire, were ideal for sniper operations. The Germans, now on the defensive, expanded their sniper program significantly. Dedicated sniper courses were established, and soldiers with demonstrated marksmanship ability were pulled from regular units for training. The Wehrmacht also began experimenting with semi-automatic sniper rifles. The Gewehr 43, a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle, could be fitted with a ZF4 scope and used for sniping. The advantage of a semi-automatic was follow-up shots. A bolt-action rifle required the shooter to work the bolt between shots, breaking sight picture and creating delay. A semi-automatic allowed for faster engagement of multiple targets or quick corrections if the first shot missed. The drawback was reliability. Semi-automatic rifles were more complex and prone to malfunction, especially in mud and extreme cold. Most German snipers stuck with the Kar 98K for its proven durability, but the G43 found use in situations where volume of fire mattered more than absolute precision. One German sniper who emerged during this period was Matthias Hetzenauer, an Austrian from the Tyrol region who was conscripted into the 3rd Mountain Division. Hetzenauer had grown up hunting chamois in the Alps, and he brought that mountain fieldcraft to the Eastern Front. His commonly cited kill total is 345 confirmed, a figure that places him among the most lethal snipers of the war. Hetzenauer fought primarily in defensive actions operating from prepared hides during Soviet offensives. His method relied on camouflage and terrain use. In the forests and hills of Ukraine and Belarusia, he would position himself on ridgelines or in tree lines that overlooked Soviet approach routes. He used natural cover, foliage, and earth to blend in, becoming invisible until the moment he fired. Then he would displace immediately, moving to a secondary position before Soviet counterfire could locate him. Hetzenauer's approach was conservative. He did not take risky shots, he did not expose himself unnecessarily. He worked with a spotter who provided observation and security, allowing Hetzenauer to focus entirely on the shot. His targets were primarily officers, radio operators, and machine gunners, the personnel whose loss would disrupt Soviet attacks. He understood that his role was not to stop an offensive, but to slow it, to create hesitation, to make Soviet commanders think twice about massing troops in the open. One engagement that illustrated Hetzenauer's method occurred during a Soviet attack near Zhytomyr in late 1943. The Red Army was pushing west, and German forces were conducting a fighting withdrawal. Hetzenauer's unit was tasked with holding a ridgeline long enough for the main body to withdraw to new positions. Hetzenauer set up on the ridgeline's reverse slope, with a clear view of the valley below where Soviet infantry would have to advance. He wore a ghillie suit, a hand-constructed garment of netting and vegetation that broke up his outline. His spotter, a soldier named Roche, was positioned 20 meters away with binoculars. When the Soviet attack began, Hetzenauer waited. He watched battalion-strength formations move through the valley, but he did not fire. He was looking for specific targets. Then he saw them. A group of officers gathered around a map near a command vehicle, identifiable by their insignia, and the deference other soldiers showed them. Hetzenauer ranged the distance at 400 meters. Wind was light, left to right. He adjusted his scope, settled his breathing, and fired. One officer dropped. The group scattered. Hetzenauer worked the bolt, reacquired, and fired again. Another hit. Then he and Roche withdrew, low-crawling backwards over the ridgeline before Soviet mortars could respond. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute. but the Soviet attack in that sector faltered for hours while new command arrangements were made. Soviet snipers, meanwhile, were being deployed in ever greater numbers. By 1943, the Red Army had trained thousands of snipers, male and female, and they were integrated into every rifle division. Each regiment typically had a sniper platoon, and some divisions had entire sniper companies. This organizational structure allowed for massed sniper employment. During major offensives, sniper teams would be concentrated in sectors where German defenses were strongest, with the mission of suppressing enemy fire and creating gaps for assault troops to exploit. One such sniper was Rosa Shanina, a young woman from a village in the Arkhangelsk region. Shanina trained at the Central Women's Sniper School and was deployed to the 3rd Belarusian Front in 1943. She specialized in what Soviet doctrine called double kills, engaging 2 targets in rapid succession before they could take cover. This required exceptional speed and accuracy. Shanina used a standard Mosin Nagant with PU scope, but she practiced her bolt manipulation until it became automatic, a fluid motion that allowed her to chamber a new round without losing sight picture. Her documented kills numbered in the dozens, though exact figures vary depending on the source. What made her noteworthy was her survival. Many female snipers died in their first months of combat. Shanina fought for over a year before being killed in action in East Prussia in January 1945. The year 1943 also saw increased German attention to counter-sniper operations. The Wehrmacht developed what they called sniper storms, concentrated artillery and mortar fire directed at suspected sniper hides. If a Soviet sniper revealed his position even for a moment, German forward observers would call in fire missions. The sniper might not be hit directly, but the blast and fragmentation would force him to abandon the hide or risk being buried alive. This tactic was most effective in open ground or forests where hides were limited. In urban ruins or dense woodland with multiple concealment options, sniper storms were less useful because the sniper could simply move. Another German counter-sniper method was the use of scout sniper teams. These were pairs or small groups of soldiers trained in both reconnaissance and sniping. Their mission was to infiltrate Soviet-held territory, locate sniper hides through patient observation, and either kill the snipers or call in fire missions. One such team, operating near the Dnieper River in autumn 1943, spent 5 days observing a Soviet strongpoint from a hide in a reed bed. They identified 3 separate sniper positions used in rotation by a Soviet team. Rather than engage directly, the German team reported the positions to their battalion, which planned a night raid. The raid succeeded, killing 2 Soviet snipers and capturing their equipment. Intelligence gained from the captured rifles and notes provided insight into Soviet sniper tactics in that sector. The Eastern Front in 1943 was a war of exhaustion. Both sides were spent bleeding divisions white in offensives and counter-offensives that gained and lost the same ground repeatedly. In this environment, the sniper's ability to inflict casualties without risking large-scale engagement made him invaluable. A single sniper could tie down an entire enemy company, forcing them to move at night, to dig deeper, to use more resources for protection. The psychological impact was cumulative. Soldiers who spent months under sniper threat developed acute stress reactions. They flinched at sounds. They froze when movement was necessary. They made mistakes born of fear, and those mistakes got them killed. The summer of 1944 brought Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center and liberated Belorussia. The scale of the disaster for Germany was staggering. Over 500,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in 6 weeks. The front collapsed, and the Red Army advanced hundreds of kilometers, reaching the borders of East Prussia by autumn. This was no longer a war of static lines and prepared defenses. This was mobile warfare, pursuit, and the systematic destruction of German combat power. But even in this fluid environment, snipers remained relevant. As German forces retreated, they conducted rearguard actions to slow the Soviet advance. Snipers were integral to these delaying actions. A German sniper team could position itself at a river crossing, a forest defilade, or a village outskirts and hold up Soviet columns for hours. The method was simple: shoot the lead vehicle's driver or commander, causing the column to halt. shoot anyone who tried to recover the vehicle or clear the obstruction, force the Soviets to deploy, call in artillery, and assault the position. By the time they did, the German sniper was gone, moving to the next delaying position. This leapfrog retreat, covered by snipers and small infantry detachments, could not stop the Soviet advance, but it bought time for main forces to establish new defensive lines. One German sniper involved in these rearguard actions was Josef Allerberger, known as Sepp, an Austrian soldier from the 1st Mountain Division. Allerberger's commonly cited kill total is 257 confirmed, a figure drawn from his memoirs and unit records. He fought across the Eastern Front from the Caucasus to the Baltic, but his most intense period was during the retreats of 1944. Allerberger was a hunter before the war, and he approached sniping with the patience and discipline of stalking game. He once wrote that the key to survival as a sniper was knowing when not to shoot. A tempting target at long range, a difficult shot in poor light, a situation where exfiltration was uncertain, these were traps. Allerberger took only shots he was confident he could make, and only when he had a clear escape route planned. During the retreat through the Baltic states in late summer 1944, Allerberger operated in the forests outside Riga. Soviet forces were pushing hard, trying to cut off German units before they could reach the coast. Allerberger's mission was to slow Soviet reconnaissance elements, giving German units time to disengage. He worked alone, without a spotter, relying on his fieldcraft. He would move at night, select a hide before dawn, and wait. When Soviet scouts or forward patrols entered his kill zone, he would engage, usually killing 1 or 2 men before displacing. The trick was never to be where the Soviets expected. He avoided obvious hides like tree lines or hilltops. Instead, he used low ground, ditches, thickets, places where a soldier would not expect a threat. He also used the forest's natural sounds to mask his movement, displacing when wind rustled branches or when Soviet artillery fire provided acoustic cover. The German military by mid-1944 had formalized its recognition of snipers with the introduction of the Scharfschützenabzeichen on August 20th. The badge had 3 classes. The 3rd class, a silver badge, was awarded for 20 confirmed kills. The 2nd class, a silver badge with oak leaves, required 40 kills. The 1st class, a gold badge, required 60 confirmed kills. These thresholds were commonly stated and represented the Wehrmacht's acknowledgement that sniping had become a specialized, valued skill. The timing of the badge's introduction is significant. By late 1944, Germany was on the defensive everywhere, and snipers were one of the few force multipliers available to slow the advancing Allies on both fronts. Soviet snipers pushing west faced different challenges. They were no longer defending familiar ground. They were advancing through hostile territory, and local populations in places like Poland and the Baltic states were not always friendly. Soviet sniper teams had to be wary of partisans, civilian informants, and the possibility of ambush. The Germans, fighting on or near their own soil, had local knowledge and sometimes civilian support. This made infiltration and hide selection more dangerous for Soviet snipers. Despite these challenges, Soviet sniper doctrine continued to evolve. By 1944, the Red Army was using snipers not just for attrition but for specific missions. Sniper teams were assigned to target enemy artillery observers, to suppress machine gun nests before assaults, to interdict German supply routes, and to provide overwatch for Soviet infantry attacks. This mission-specific tasking made snipers more than just killers. They became tactical assets, integrated into combined arms operations. One example of this integration occurred during the Soviet assault on Königsberg in East Prussia in early 1945, though the planning began in late 1944. Königsberg was a fortress city, heavily defended by German forces determined to hold. Soviet planners knew that assaulting the city would be costly. To reduce casualties, they deployed sniper teams days before the main assault, with orders to infiltrate the outer defences and target German strongpoints. These snipers operated at night, moving through sewer systems and bombed-out neighbourhoods to reach positions overlooking German lines. From these positions, they observed and reported on German dispositions, and when the assault began, they engaged German machine gunners and anti-tank crews, suppressing fire long enough for Soviet infantry to close the distance. The sniper war in 1944 was no longer just about individuals with rifles. It was about institutionalized, systematized application of long-range precision fire as part of broader operational plans. Both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht understood this. The difference was that the Soviets had the manpower, the training infrastructure, and the momentum. The Germans had experience and desperation. The last year of the war brought the front to German soil. The Red Army crossed into East Prussia in January 1945, and by February, Soviet forces were on the Oder River, the last natural barrier before Berlin. The German military, hollowed out by years of attrition, was disintegrating. Divisions existed in name only, their ranks filled with old men, teenagers, and convalescents. Yet the fighting did not stop. If anything, it intensified. Germans were now defending their homeland, and Soviet soldiers, having seen what the Wehrmacht had done to their country, were in no mood for mercy. The sniper war, which had begun in forests and fields in 1941, would end in the ruins of cities and the desperate last stands along the Oder. East Prussia in January and February 1945 was a nightmare. The region was packed with refugees fleeing west, roads choked with civilians and retreating soldiers. Soviet forces advanced rapidly, cutting off pockets of German resistance. In this chaos, snipers on both sides operated with near-total freedom. German snipers, many veterans of years of combat, used their knowledge of local terrain to ambush Soviet columns. Soviet snipers, hardened by 4 years of war, showed no hesitation. Both sides understood this was the endgame, and the brutality reflected it. One German sniper, a sergeant from a Volksgrenadier division, operated in the forests south of Königsberg during the Soviet encirclement of the city. He had no illusions about victory. His mission was simply to kill as many Soviet soldiers as possible before he died. He worked from hides along roads and trails, targeting officers and vehicle crews. In 1 week, he claimed 18 kills. Then a Soviet artillery spotter team located his general area and called in a Katyusha strike. He survived by sheltering in a drainage culvert, but the forest around him was leveled. He withdrew west, eventually reaching German lines near the Frisches Haff, where he was killed in an infantry assault. Soviet snipers in East Prussia faced a different environment. The region's terrain was a mix of forests, agricultural land, and small towns. German defences were improvised, often centred on villages or road junctions. Soviet sniper teams would infiltrate at night, occupy positions in barns or houses on the outskirts of German-held villages, and begin operations at dawn. The goal was to disrupt German defensive preparations, to kill commanders and specialists, and to create fear. One Soviet sniper pair, operating near the town of Elbing, spent 3 days in a burned-out farmhouse overlooking a German headquarters. They observed vehicle movements, troop rotations, and supply deliveries, reporting all to their command. When Soviet artillery finally opened fire on the headquarters, the sniper pair provided spotting corrections, then withdrew under the cover of the barrage. By March, Soviet forces had reached the Oder and were preparing for the final assault on Berlin. The Oder line was heavily defended. The Germans had fortified the west bank with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Soviet forces massed on the east bank, building up supplies and reinforcements. Snipers on both sides worked constantly. German snipers, positioned on the high ground west of the river, observed Soviet preparations and engaged targets of opportunity. Soviet snipers infiltrating across the river at night or operating from the east bank targeted German observation posts and artillery crews. The crossing of the Oder in mid-April was a bloodbath. Soviet forces launched massive artillery barrages, followed by assaults across the river under heavy fire. Snipers played a critical role. German snipers attempted to pick off boat crews and officers directing the assault. Soviet snipers, crossing with the first waves, targeted German machine gun nests and bunkers, suppressing fire long enough for assault teams to close. The fighting was close, brutal, and relentless. Snipers had little time for careful stalking or patient observation. This was direct action shooting, picking targets in the open and engaging as fast as possible. One Soviet sniper, a veteran of Stalingrad who had survived 3 years of combat, was killed on the west bank of the Oder on the first day of the assault. He had crossed the river with an infantry battalion and was moving toward a German bunker complex when a German sniper, concealed in a shell crater, shot him through the chest. The German sniper in turn was killed minutes later by Soviet artillery. Neither man's name appears in any historical record. They were simply two more casualties in a battle that consumed thousands. Berlin in April and May 1945 was the final chapter of the Sniper War. The city, already heavily damaged by Allied bombing, became a battleground. Soviet forces entered the suburbs on April 20th and began fighting their way toward the city centre. Berlin was ideal terrain for snipers. The ruins provided countless hides. Sightlines down broad avenues gave clear fields of fire, and the desperate, chaotic nature of the fighting meant targets were everywhere. German defenders, a mix of Wehrmacht remnants, SS units, Hitler Youth and Volkssturm militia, used snipers to slow the Soviet advance. German snipers positioned themselves in upper floors of buildings, in church steeples, in bombed-out department stores. They engaged Soviet infantry moving down streets, Soviet engineers clearing rubble, Soviet artillery crews setting up guns. The impact was significant in the early days of the battle. Soviet units found themselves pinned down by single snipers who could dominate entire blocks. The solution was overwhelming firepower. Soviet forces would identify a suspected sniper hide and destroy it with tank fire or artillery. Entire buildings were leveled to eliminate snipers. Soviet snipers in Berlin operated aggressively. They moved with assault teams, providing overwatch and engaging German strongpoints. One Soviet sniper team, attached to a rifle company assaulting a government building, used the rubble to approach within 100 meters of a German machine gun position. The sniper, using a captured German rifle with superior optics, killed the machine gunner and then the assistant gunner when he took over the weapon. The Soviet infantry, freed from suppression, rushed the position and cleared the building. The fighting in Berlin was not grand strategy or tactical brilliance. It was grinding, block by block, building by building attrition. Snipers were just one part of that attrition, but they remained deadly to the end. In the final days of April, as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery and the Führer bunker, German snipers were still operating, killing Soviet soldiers even as the regime they served was collapsing into oblivion. On May 2nd, 1945, Berlin surrendered. The war in Europe ended a week later. The Sniper War, which had begun in the forests west of Moscow in 1941, was over. In 4 years, it had consumed tens of thousands of lives, shaped the tactics and operations of entire armies, and left a legacy of terror and legend that would define the Eastern Front in military history. The Sniper War of the Eastern Front was unique in scale and intensity. No other theatre of World War II saw sniping employed so systematically, so ruthlessly, and by so many participants. The reasons were structural. The Eastern Front was vast, static for long periods, and fought with a level of brutality that made individual human life cheap. In such conditions, the sniper emerged as a cost-effective way to inflict casualties and exert psychological pressure. The Red Army's institutionalization of snipers was unprecedented. By the end of the war, the Soviets had trained an estimated tens of thousands of snipers, integrated them into Doctrine, equipped them with standardized weapons and optics, and celebrated their achievements in propaganda. This was not ad hoc or improvisational. It was industrial. The creation of dedicated sniper schools, including the Central Women's Sniper Training School, demonstrated a commitment to making sniping a permanent part of military capability. The German approach, by contrast, was reactive. Early in the war, German sniping relied on the individual initiative of hunters and marksmen within units. As the war dragged on and the Wehrmacht found itself on the defensive, German military leadership formalized sniper training and recognition. The introduction of the sniper's badge in August 1944 was an acknowledgement that the battlefield had changed and that snipers were essential to defensive operations. The weapons used by both sides reflected their different philosophies and industrial capacities. The Soviet Mosin Nagant, an old design updated with optics, was reliable, simple, and effective. It could be produced in massive quantities and maintained by soldiers with minimal training. The PU scope, while not sophisticated, was adequate for the ranges at which most sniper engagements occurred. The Germans used the Kar 98K, a more refined weapon with better inherent accuracy, paired with high-quality optics from Zeiss and other manufacturers. German semi-automatic sniper rifles like the G43 offered capabilities the Soviets lacked, but were never produced in sufficient numbers to matter strategically. The human cost of the sniper war is impossible to calculate precisely. Confirmed kill totals for famous snipers like Pavlichenko, Zaitsev, Hetzenauer, and Allerberger range from the hundreds to over 300, but these figures represent only a tiny fraction of the total. Most snipers killed far fewer enemies and most died without recognition. The psychological cost, the constant fear of being watched and targeted, affected millions of soldiers on both sides. Entire units changed their behavior because of sniper threat. Attacks were delayed, routes were altered, and operations were cancelled because commanders knew snipers were waiting. The legacy of the Eastern Front's sniper war extends beyond World War II. Post-war military training incorporated lessons learned from Soviet and German snipers. The importance of camouflage, fieldcraft, observation, and patience became standard doctrine. The pairing of shooter and spotter, pioneered by the Soviets, remains the fundamental organization of modern sniper teams. The psychological dimension of sniper warfare, the understanding that a single marksman can create disproportionate fear, shaped counterinsurgency and urban combat doctrine in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. But the Eastern Front's sniper war was also shaped by the unique horrors of that conflict. The genocidal nature of the German invasion, the atrocities committed by both sides, and the sheer scale of suffering meant that snipers were operating in an environment of total war. There were no clean hands, no moral high ground. Soviet snipers killed German soldiers, many of whom were conscripts with no say in Hitler's invasion. German snipers killed Soviet soldiers, men and women defending their homeland from annihilation. The sniper's rifle was a tool of a larger machinery of death, and reducing that machinery to individual stories of heroism or skill misses the broader, darker reality. The Eastern Front was where the modern concept of the sniper as a professional, trained and integrated military specialty was born. It was forged in frozen forests, blasted ruins, and the killing fields of the steppe. It was built on the bodies of soldiers who learned too late that being seen even for a second meant death, and it was sustained by the willingness of thousands of individuals to sit motionless for hours or days, waiting for the opportunity to kill another human being from a distance. The sniper war ended with the war itself in May 1945, but its lessons, its methods, and its cold, patient lethality lived on. The Eastern Front had turned marksmanship into an industry of survival and death, and the world learned from it. That, perhaps, is the real legacy. Not the legends of individual snipers, but the institutionalization of a way of fighting that treated human life as just another target in the scope.